game I'm going to show you was my pick for best game in the ACO World Senior 50 Plus Championship played in Crete in October. Features a really nice recipe against the Benoni Gambit that rather turns the tables on black. If you're interested in playing one of the ACO events, that's the Amateur Chess Organisation, I can highly recommend these tournaments. Next events are on the Greek island of Kos next May. There's from the 2nd to 11th of May, there's the ACO 65 Plus Championship, and then there's the World Amateur Championship 11th to the 20th of May. Players are grouped according to rating, so no matter what your strength is, you never feel out of your depth. You get Grandmaster instruction after your games from yours truly, and there's also two other Grandmasters, Zigurd Lanka and Spiridon Skembris. It's a really friendly event. It's a wonderful hotel. Full details on the ACO website. I cannot recommend these events highly enough. Right, let's get stuck into this game. So, playing white, Nick Schoonmaker, who's from Arizona in the States, came all the way over to Greece to play in the tournament, and Francois Buchs playing black. So Nick opened with d4, and this is the Benoni Gambit, which I've always thought is very well motivated. You know, black is trying to seize the initiative right from the word go. And the basic idea is if white accepts the pawn, then black is going to have play on the semi-open A and B files, and in combination with that bishop on g7, white has to be careful. And that's why I think this is a very interesting reaction. b6. Nick said after the game that he was inspired to play this, having seen some games by Alexei Shirov, who specialised in this move a few years ago. And the idea is simply that instead of taking the pawn, you just push on, and that keeps the A file closed. So white only has to worry about one semi-open file. And while black is collecting that pawn, then white starts to generate play on the other side of the board. And now I think the best move is simply to play queen takes pawn. But rook b8 played instead, and I don't think black really wants to take that pawn with a rook, so I think that's a bit indecisive. You know, every move counts in the opening, that's the thing. And Nick decided to take advantage of that and launched forward on the king side with f4, and that's very much in Shirov's style, you know, really just wanting to generate an attack on the king side. I think black got a bit spooked here. I think you've just got to press on with g6 and bishop g7, but I think black panicked and played e6, wanting to counter f4. And here I think Nick reacted very well. Instead of leaving the pawn, he exchanged off, and that leaves these pawns rather sensitive. Also, this diagonal could be rather sensitive, as we're going to find out. So even if black's king gets to the king side, it's just a little bit exposed. Knight f3, yep, good development. Bishop e7, bishop d3, I like that. The bishop is pointing in the right direction at the king side. Knight takes b6, so black recovers the pawn. And white castles. So already, I mean, this is a very attractive setup for white. Excuse me. And if black castles, then I think one can already consider playing e5 to open up the bishop. Notice there are just two pawns in front of white's king. And with the bishop on d3 and, you know, maybe a queen coming to c2, the king side is already very sensitive. So I think that motivated black to play pawn to e5 to block this one. But this leaves terrible weaknesses on d5 on this diagonal. And queen e2 played. Okay, very sensible move, thinking about playing bishop c4. In fact, it's possible to take that pawn. And here's the trick. Queen d4 check does not win a piece. Yes, it's a double attack, but after king h1, queen takes knight, bishop f4 wins that rook on b8. So yeah, it was possible just to take this pawn. But queen e2 is very sensible. Just a nice square for the queen and start to take control over those light squares. Queen c7 played to protect that pawn. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. And you can see that structurally white is doing well. These pawns are split. In itself that's not terrible, but it means that, for example, that white can take control over this square and set up on this diagonal. That's possible. I remember when I looked at this game afterwards with Nick, I was going, well, take the pawn on a6. I was being very greedy indeed. But black can just castle there and the game lurches on. And in a way, I think what Nick did is much better because, or let's just say more, I think it poses more practical questions for black. Because, I mean, this pawn isn't really very important. But this development of the bishop to b2 is very nice indeed. Black castled, bishop b2. White has superb pieces, so there's potentially pressure on this pawn, and yeah, don't forget this diagonal as well. Here black played knight g4, which I think is a big mistake. I think the only chance for black is simply to get rid of that pawn. So white can't do this because there's a pin. So white would have to play pawn takes pawn. And then knight h5. Looking at coming in here, and I mean, this pawn sacrifice makes sense of black's pieces. The rook has come into play. This knight has something to do. There's potential for a bishop or a queen to come here. And obviously white has to watch out for this one as well. That would require some careful thought from white. I think c4 is certainly the best option. But knight g4 played, and now Nick swings into action. Bishop c4 check. Takes. Check. King steps in the corner, and yeah, it's this square which means that white is totally dominating, and that was the problem with black playing e5 in the first place. With these pawns here, that d5 square is just open for the knight. So the queen is attacked. Queen a7. And knight takes e5. Now everything is just falling into place for white. This is beautiful. So there are now threats on the f-file. This is a threat. That bishop on b2 is a monster looking at g7. And the game ended like this. Rook b4. Black is trying to get a bit tricky here with some taking and then some kind of discovered check here. But of course there's no need to take that. And in fact, this is an excellent riposte. Knight takes. So you can see there's a threat of mate here. So queen takes, protects the rook on f8. An exchange of rooks. And instead of moving the queen, rook f1 is excellent. Just taking the initiative, not slowing down at all. And this is completely winning because knight f7 is coming soon. Knight f6 played to protect the queen, but knight f7 check anyway, forcing king here. Double discovered check. King h8, and now some flash at the end of the game. Let's have a bit of flash. Here we go. Rook takes knight. Really nice. Queen takes rook. Queen g8 mate. And if pawn takes, then bishop takes and queen g8 mate. Queen e8 played in the game, and queen f7 was an emphatic final move. Black actually can't avoid mate here after queen takes, rook takes. That bishop is threatening to mate here, and there's also rook f8. And so, for example, rook takes, bishop g7 is mate. So there we go. I think that final position certainly shows what white is about in this variation. When you play with b6, basically you're just aiming to keep the queen side closed and attack on the king side. Mission accomplished. So well played to Nick Schoonmaker, and he won one of the best game prizes at the ACO 50 Plus event in October.